In a previous video, I mentioned that the central issue of progressivism is big business, right? So in 1901, we have huge corporations, right? We have stuff like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel. And as we've seen, they actually do good things. They produce cheaper products. They have to provide steady employment. But on the other hand, they also can abuse their power, right? They can have monopoly power. They could also ruin the environment. So the question, therefore, is going to be this. What are you going to do? How is the public going to deal with big business? We saw in the Gilded Age that laissez-faire really doesn't work, right? It's going to allow all of these companies to have abuse their power and to abuse their be abusive in their practices, right? So that's not an answer. We could also do antitrust, right? We can break them up, make them into smaller companies, through what's known as through the Sherman Antitrust Act, right? And then finally, we can regulate them, right? We can use regulation. Generally speaking, it means you don't need to break up the monopoly. You don't need to break up the trust. But what's going to happen is you're going to have the government regulating, overseeing what these companies are doing to prevent any type of abuse. It's generally said that progressivism starts with the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. You have to remember that Roosevelt becomes president of the United States because of the fact that he's vice president under McKinley, who dies, who he's assassinated right after the beginning of McKinley's second term, right? So TR is going to be president of the United States. To understand what he's doing, you have to understand a little bit about him. He's born in an aristocratic family. He comes from old money. He has the best education, right? He's educated at Harvard. He makes his way into politics and becomes a politician that actually looks and listens to people's problems, right? So he's actually going to be a legislature that is going to listen to people's problems and actually propose legislation towards it. Now, Roosevelt loved power. Power for himself, power for the government, power for the United States. Did big business mean big power? Absolutely. And he loved it and supported it. But he had another word that he liked to use. He liked to use responsibility. He believed that with great power comes great responsibility. He was not a plutocrat. He believed that with this great power came the responsibility, and with the example particularly of Cornelius Vanderbilt, basically throwing around his money, right? Roosevelt was concerned with the public reaction of many of these plutocrats throwing around their money. So Roosevelt becomes a reformer, not so much because of the fact that he was against the power of big companies, but because he was fearful that the system would break down through corruption. Roosevelt was a progressive reformer because he was a conservative. He wanted to save the capitalistic system in place. And Roosevelt would always advocate regulation of big business rather than antitrust.